Cheyenne drove her horse to top speed and headed for the city gate. The 2 soldiers were right about closing it for the night, so no one can go in or out. Just some further unnecessary security measure of the king. But she couldn't take that into account right now. Without slowing down, they came closer and closer to the gate, and in the moment the guards noticed them, Falconheart had already rushed through, having the guards jump aside so that they wouldn't be ran over. As soon as she passed the gate, she steered her horse to the right, and she took a northern direction. She looked behind her to see where Adukas was. The fairy wolf ran closely behind them, but he didn't seem to be the only one. A few meters away from him the girl saw another horse galloping. It was very fast and carried a blonde rider. Xava. It didn't take him long to catch up with her and cantered next to Falconheart. Shiva, Xava's mare, was a little faster than the brown stallion and smaller. She had sensors as well in her long mane, but hers were pink. Just as Cheyenne's horse, Shiva came from a research facility, but one could tell that just by seeing her. She had no ordinary color. In the laboratory, research for the Knights' purposes took place, and those who are known under the name of Light Knights had owned the color they called white. There are legends and rumors about it in the Undercity, and it was called the Forbidden Color. And that's no exaggeration, since it was an artificial color that couldn't be found in the nature of Terranox Libertia. Oddly enough, though, there was one single spot where the color white could be seen, in the vitreous of the human eye, and nobody in the Undercity could explain why that's a thing. In the laboratory there was a lot of research for this color, and it became the trademark of the Knights. And they wanted to have horses in just that color so that everyone would know who they're dealing with. Shiva was such a horse, but something went wrong with the experiments, which happens a lot, and the Knights don't want horses which are not entirely white. Today most of them have got horses whose genes are manipulated, so that they carry the forbidden color, and due to that they are surely sentenced to a short life. Xava's mare would also never become as old as normal horses would become, but at least she got better chances than the white horses of the Knights. Falconheart's experiment went wrong as well, since his body didn't take the forbidden color, and thus both horses were sentenced to death. They got lucky though that Cheyenne and Xava always visited the horses in the research facility back then, and they noticed what had been happening, what should happen to Shiva and Falconheart. So the 2 friends freed them by night, and ever since then the horses were at their sides. The Knights didn't think it was necessary back then to regain the horses. The only thing they did was closing the research facility for publicity. Sometime after that they had built the high-voltage fence around Exiduma Magna and the city gate. Ever since that they started experimenting with humans too. Many people that couldn't pay their taxes had been transported there instead of being decapitated at once. In the Undercity, the research facility was known as Human Ranch due to that. There were rumors about the most cruel things about the ranch. Never had someone returned from there, and exactly to this laboratory they took Cheyenne's grandparents. Xava, what are you doing here? But instead of answering Cheyenne's question, he let Shiva run in front of Falconheart and cut his way. Then he suddenly stopped his mare. The brown stallion had no choice but to stop as well. The girl fell on the neck of her horse and got back up. Both horses were dancing around nervously and seemed to be confused about the sudden loss of speed. Shiva lifted up her front legs and whinnied shrill and powerful. Falconheart answered with an indignant snort. Are you nuts? What are you doing? Cheyenne's eyes narrowed and looked angry at Xava. I had to cut your way there, otherwise you would have never stopped. He tried to get the situation under control. His friend had to become calmer, but she didn't even think about calming down. I don't have time for this, and you know that. Let me pass this instant. If I come too late because of you, I will never ever forgive you. Cheyenne, calm down, will you? Do you really think you could save them if you just go there without any plan and without any care? Do you really think they will just let you walk in and watch you free two of their test persons? Are you really that naive? The girl looked away dejected, then stared at the ground. No, but what else am I supposed to do? If you got any better idea, then tell me! A few seconds they both remained silent. The only things that were to hear were the panting of the fairy wolf and the snorting of the horses. Xaver broke the silence at first. Listen, I know how much you wish to save your grandparents, but don't you see that the situation is, pretty hopeless? Cheyenne gazed at him sadly before she started saying something too. I was taught to never give up hope. There is always a way. It seems to be difficult to save the two of them, but if I only believe enough in this and don't surrender, I will be able to do it. She was surprised how convincing and strong her voice sounded. Xaver looked at her seriously, then nodded. Very well. I guess I can't stop you, but then at least let me come with you, okay? Cheyenne was fine with that, even though she was worried. It was good to have Xaver at her side. She wasn't alone and she felt better with him around, but at the same time she had some worried thoughts. I hope we can make it somehow and save grandfather and grandmother, but I really get him into a dangerous situation here. But he is as stubborn as I am, and he would never just stay behind and let me go alone. To discuss things with him would only steal more time. Besides, he always remains calm, no matter the situation. He can think clearly, and I guess that's necessary there. And if it's the two of us, that's better than being alone. Besides, I feel safer with him around. Cheyenne and Xaver moved on, cantering side by side. The merciless rain fell down on them, and the wind made the grass rustle. The bright shine of Exidoma Magna that lit up the path up until now slowly faded. I can barely see anything now. It's way too dark. I can only make out the silhouettes of our horses, especially Shiva. One can see her bright color well even at night. Xaver regretted the thoughtless departure. He should have taken his chroma flashlight with him. I can see enough. Really weird how you are blind like moles in the night. I can't even imagine. Well, but you're hearing the hoofbeats on the ground, so you know where I am. Good that I know where the lab is, right? Cheyenne thought it was a pity that her friend couldn't see the beauty of the night. The plains they were riding along now were dyed in a pretty black that was brighter close up than in the distance. The grass's height was varying. In the distance she saw the beginning of the forest. The rain made it difficult, though, to see very far. Xaver sighed. Blind like a mole? I would like to know how you see things in the dark. I can barely see my own hand in front of my eyes. His voice sounded sad and full of longing. He would really like to know how it feels to see well in the dark, but he certainly knew that that would never be happening. He shook his head and got rid of his thoughts right away. For a while the two remained silent, and Cheyenne had to think about her grandparents again. She really hoped that they were still alive, and that she would be able to save them. Her thoughts were disrupted, though, as she could make out some sort of light source in the distance. But at closer look it wasn't that far away, and the two friends stopped their horses. Arukas laid down in the wet grass and spectated the shine too. The shimmer came from a huge building that seemed similar to a fabric, and it lit up the night there. But it was no chroma shine, but white shine. This building was without a doubt the laboratory from which they rescued Falconheart and Shiva, and where they took Cheyenne's grandparents. Is that? But I thought it only exists in the upper city's noble quarters. Cheyenne was confused and unsettled because of the unnatural shine. Xaver stared at the color as well, in which the building was dived into. Yeah, you're right. It looks like the lamps in the noble quarters, but I thought they were made because the nobles ordered them. I heard they wanted to show their loyalty to the king that way. But why would they use them here? Chroma lamps shine way further than this white light. Cheyenne winced hearing that last word coming from Xava's mouth and glanced at him angrily. "You dare speak out the forbidden word?" In the Undercity, the word light was connected to the nights and to evil, so it was never spoken out and forbidden. Children are learning this since their birth, that the word must never be spoken. If they do it regardless, a little punishment awaits them, so they don't do it again. Xaver knew his friend was correct with that one and was intimidated. "Oh yeah, right. But I heard how some of the knights called the lamps and the street lanterns that." Cheyenne sighed and looked at the lamps more accurate. They seemed like the chroma flood lamps at the marketplace of the capital city. Those were special lamps that had bigger chroma fragments in them so they could shine brighter and wider than normal chroma street lanterns. Just that these lamps here gave away some white shine, which was enormously bright but didn't shine very far. Chroma shine, though, reached very far. Against that, this light just reached a few meters. Also, there were no chroma fragments on these lights, but some kind of glass vessel with some kind of device which produced the shine. The longer Cheyenne looked at the large lamps, the more her eyes hurt. She no longer felt well and even got a headache. She could look at chroma shine for hours without feeling bad in any way. Xaver also seemed to feel something slowly because his eyes began to tear and he often blinked. Then he shook his head. "This light is terrible. You can't say that out loud. My eyes burn like fire." Cheyenne averted her gaze from the lamps and rubbed her eyes. The two rode on. Some large boulders surrounded the farm, and Cheyenne and Xaver decided to hide the horses behind one of them. Adoka slowly crept closer to the lab like a cat, the two friends close behind him. The building was huge and surrounded by separate fences. They almost looked like enclosures, and in some of them there were people and also creatures that the two had never seen before. The entrance was marked by a huge gate and a subsequent transparent tunnel. An enormously large triangular wall with transmitters at the top rose into the sky. Behind it were two differently large high walls, which were also separated by a large pyramid-shaped wall. The building behind the partition walls was larger than the one in between, and the enclosures emanated from it. The entrance was guarded by 3 knights. "A lot has changed since we were last here. I would guess that they are holding their test subjects in the large hall. This means that we have to walk through the whole complex, but without anyone discovering us. That will prove difficult." Xaver surveyed the entire building and then rested his gaze anxiously on the entrance. "These soldiers don't look friendly either. They won't just let us walk in." As he finished speaking, Cheyenne rose from her crouching position and ran back to the horses. From her saddlebag she grabbed the black white belt and put it on. Then she took the unfoldable bow and attached it to the sling provided for this purpose, which the girl had specifically sewn on, so she did not have to hold the combat tool in her hand all the time, but could still have it with her. Cheyenne went back to Xaver. He also had a belt and had already strapped it on. Just like herself, he also sewed on a fastening option for his old scratched sword. She remembered both sitting at his mother's kitchen table and doing their best to turn the simple belts into real weapon belts. It had taken a long time before the snares could actually hold their weapons instead of letting them fall through. But when it actually worked out, the friends had been very proud and happy about it. To this day, the homemade battle belts have served their purpose, and there were no signs that the snares would break or go off. "What are you up to?" Xaver watched his friend open the bow and aim in the direction of the soldiers. "I distract them so we can get to this front gate unnoticed. Or do you want to go to them and ask them if they mind if we go in there for a moment and deprive them of 2 test subjects?" Without taking her eyes off the intended goal, Cheyenne teased her companion with the last sentence he had also said to her a few minutes ago and waited for his answer. However, he didn't say anything, and she took it as a no. She concentrated as best as her current situation allowed and shot the black arrow into the grass a few meters away from the entrance. The spot was just so in the glow of the white float lamp, so that the knights had to take a look to be able to see more precisely. The friends hoped that the three guards had seen the arrow, because the air was pouring far too loudly on the metal building complex to hear the rupture of the air during flight or the impact of the dark object. The knights actually seemed to have noticed something. It looked like they were discussing what to do. However, they did not seem to consider it important enough to leave their post. Adukas glanced briefly in the direction where the two friends were squatting behind the rock, and then trotted off in the direction where the arrow had fallen. There he barked, attracting the full attention of the guards. Two of them slowly moved towards him to look. One pulled his sword out of his scabbard and held it menacingly aside, ready to attack. The other walked a little behind his colleague and rested his hand on the hilt of the sword. Cheyenne didn't think twice and started running. The grass was wet and slippery, and she almost fell. Xaver, who was puzzled and annoyed by his friend's hasty, unreasonable, and haphazard action, had no choice but to run after her. She ran straight towards the entrance of the building, hoping that the third guard standing slightly to the side would continue to observe his colleagues and not notice them. But when she tried to open the gate, but it didn't move an inch, the knight turned around and discovered her. He approached Cheyenne and drew his sword. The guard was quite tall, and his armor shone silver and white in the bright glow of the float lamp. He growled like a dog, and the girl stared at him. Her heart was racing, and she was terrified. She gasped, saw that she could not avoid him, and ran away, and turned to the front gate. Desperately she tried to open it. The only way to escape the night was to escape through this gate into the interior of the building. But the huge metal door just wouldn't open, and Cheyenne felt the man in armor grab her by the waist. Then he gripped her body at this point with one arm. With the other hand he held his sword to her neck and pressed so that she could no longer breathe. Cheyenne was shaking and gasping for breath, but was not allowed to move too much, because then this sharp sword would cut into her neck. She felt stabbing pain and the strong grip of the knight, which also affected her. She would not be able to stand under these conditions for long, but she had to persevere. The sharp cold blade was slowly moved by the guard, and she felt blood flowing down her neck. She felt the warm breath of her enemy on the back of her neck as he began to laugh softly. Cheyenne desperately tried to remove the sword from her neck with her hands, with the result that she slit her hands and the blade cut even more. Nevertheless, she saw this method as the only chance to free herself and kept trying. The pain was unbearable, and she would have liked to cry out loudly, but the only thing her voice gave was a few hoarse, gurgling sounds. Cheyenne felt her heartbeat pounding in her throat, and her vision became blurred. She felt weak. "Let go of me! I can't give up now! I have to hold on, and I have to save them!" Her legs were about to give up when she suddenly heard a muffled noise, and the knight let go of her. Cheyenne fell to her knees and gasped for air. Her eyes teared up, her heart threatened to burst. She was shaking like crazy, and the wound on her neck hurt, but somehow the guard had let go of her. She turned around and saw Xaver standing with his sword behind the knight, now lying on the ground. The man in armor was not dead, for he was still breathing and moaning a little. He just seemed to be unconscious. The girl could see that her friend was upset, but his concern still outweighed considerably. He hurried towards her and knelt down to Cheyenne. "Why didn't you tell me when you were going to run? This could have ended pretty badly. How can you be so unreasonable?" Without finishing the sentence, he sighed and closed his eyes briefly to collect himself and clear his head. "Are you okay? This cut must hurt a lot, huh? I'm sorry I couldn't free you faster, but until I realized you started running and I could follow you a few seconds past." And you can really run fast, you know that? His reaction was understandable. After all, he had been worried about Cheyenne. If he hadn't been here now, then a guy would have killed me for sure. Xava, thank you. Slowly she could breathe normally again and looked at her friend remorsefully. His stern and worried look relaxed a little, and then he looked at her wound. The girl carefully placed her hand on it and flinched in pain. Then she looked at her fingers and examined the blood that was now stuck on them. I'm fine, don't worry. Think about how we can quickly open this door, it doesn't move an inch. And the other 2 knights will be right back. Cheyenne stroked the floor with her bloody hand to wipe off the red liquid and flinched again. I had forgotten that I cut my hands on the guardian's sword. The damp soil brought dirt into her wounds, and this hurt her. The girl stood up staggeringly and tried to find her balance. It wasn't long before she could stand safely again. The rain was still falling relentlessly from the sky. Cheyenne opened her palms and let the cold water patter on them. It burned like crazy, but at least it cleaned her wounds. Meanwhile, Xava went to the fainted knight and searched his armor. Cheyenne watched his actions curiously. What are you doing? Without turning to her for answering, he searched further and finally found a metal bracelet on the knight's wrist with a round, shiny plate on it. He stood up and examined it more closely. Do you see the device next to the entrance gate? Xava moved towards it, and Cheyenne's gaze followed him. I don't think the door will open until we scan this red chip there. The girl tilted her head, hoping he would be right. Why didn't I notice that? Xava's friend admired his quick comprehension. The boy scanned the chip without any problems, and a beep sounded. It was almost as if he had done this many times before. The huge metal door opened, and the 2 friends entered. As soon as they passed through the gate, it closed again. At just the right time, because Cheyenne could hear the 2 guards coming back. She sighed in relief, as did Xava. That was really close. The friends looked around. In front of them stretched a long, large tunnel, the bottom of which was made of glass. Underneath, white flashes flashed and illuminated the way. There were no knights to be seen, far and wide, and so the 2 started moving. As they walked across the glass floor, Cheyenne noticed that the door at the end of the tunnel had also a scanning device. Xava, how did you figure out how to open the door so quickly? That was really impressive. He looked embarrassed to the side and blushed a little. Oh, that was nothing. I think in situations like right now I can think very quickly, you know. I didn't deserve the praise. He smiled at Cheyenne. Yes, you deserve it. I hope I can think as fast in the future. She wanted to return his smile, but she couldn't, given the situation. Instead, she sighed and walked faster. Xava also opened the door at the end of the tunnel, and they entered a huge hall. The walls were made of metal, illuminated by countless white lamps. In the middle of the room there was an elevator, which probably took people to the higher 2 floors above the heads of their friends. Cheyenne had never seen so many doors in a room before. They were all the same except for one, a large gate behind the elevator. On it something was written in large letters. Research. Human and animal research, sectors A to G. Comply with safety measures. That's where we have to go, Cheyenne whispered. She did not dare to speak aloud in this great hall. Her words would echo quite loudly from the metal walls, and surely someone would hear that. However, the 2 friends were currently the only ones in the large room. How curious. I had actually thought it was teeming with researchers and guards. Xava also spoke very quietly and let his gaze wander around worriedly. Maybe they'll all sleep, who knows? But we don't have time to think about it. Come on, we have to hurry up and go to the research area. With that, Cheyenne ended her friend's thinking phase and moved on, holding Xava's hand, dragging him along behind her. It's pretty cold in here. Does this white light not warm up? Chroma shine would light up the room in no time. Suddenly, a door was heard above their heads. It was opened directly above them. Fortunately, the 2 friends stood under the higher floor and would not be discovered if they were quiet. As if rooted, the two stopped and listened to the footsteps. A second door opened and closed again, then calm returned to the great hall. Cheyenne and Xaver breathed a sigh of relief and were glad they were walking along the edge of the hall. Without talking, they crept to the large metal door that led into the research complex. Xaver opened the gate and they entered the next hall. They were presented with a sight of horror. The room was considerably larger than the previous one and had several floors. On each of the levels there were candles that made up the majority of the complex. In them were half-naked, emaciated people, here and there even some without any robe. Some cried desperately for help, cried in their pain, shook the cages, and some just sat apathetically in a corner staring in front of them. On the top levels were children calling for their mothers. On the lowest level where Cheyenne and Xaver were, there were not only people in the enclosures, but also animals and even creatures that looked like a mixture of both. The monsters growled, hissed, and tried to break open the cages, but each attempt was punished with an electric shock. In the middle of the hall was the only area, illuminated by white lamps. It stretched over all floors and was divided into many rooms. Through windows you could see the procedure in it. People who were forcibly tied to couches and chairs, who were operated on, or who were instilled with something. They wriggled and whirled wildly, but in vain. They did not manage to free themselves. Animals could also be seen in the rooms. They shared the fate of the people. This area had to be the research center, and another metal door seemed to be the entrance for it. The smell of medicine and blood was in the air. Only now did Cheyenne notice the different letters on the stone floor. Presumably, they marked the different sectors, as was previously written on the large metal door, through which they had entered this very room. The two friends stood there stunned. They had not expected so much cruelty. Xaver looked down and closed his eyes. "This is terrible." He could not say more and fell back into speechlessness. Cheyenne was breathing quickly and had started shaking again. She ran off again without thinking, desperately searching every lower level cage with her eyes. Instead of stopping her, her friend accompanied her. He seemed to sense that her worries about her grandparents had just increased drastically. Between the enclosures of the different sectors, there were corridors that led outside. "I can't see them anywhere. They're not here. What am I doing now? What am I doing? I have to find them. I just have to find them." Several times now she had walked past the cages of the lower level, but could not detect her grandparents. She would have liked to call out loud for them, but she didn't dare. Knights would come immediately and discover the friends, and the girl did not want to get Xaver into more trouble than she already did. Cheyenne stopped. She didn't even try to hold back her tears and let them roll down her cheeks. Her friend caught up with her and took her in his arms. For a few seconds they stood tightly embraced. Suddenly, a loud noise and a rough voice sounded. It came from a speaker mounted on the outside of the research area. "This is Researcher 137 speaking. The preparation of subjects 278 and 279 arrived this afternoon. 74 and 70 years old has just been completed. I ask you to monitor them from now on and to record the reactions to the experiments in writing. One of the lower researchers should deal with it and then report back to me. The subjects are located in outdoor sector D, enclosure 7. End of announcement." Cheyenne broke away from Xaver, looked at him hopefully, turned around and rushed towards the corridor leading to the outer area of sector D. The friend followed her immediately, and as fast as her legs carried her, they ran outside. It was hardly colder than inside the hall, but it was still raining. Flood lamps were located to the left and the right of the separated enclosures, and so everyone would be able to discover the two friends without difficulty. Cheyenne didn't care at that moment. She forgot everything around her, because at the end of the corridor, surrounded by enclosures, there was one with the number 7 on the front door. Behind it, she could even see her grandparents. Her heart jumped and she ran faster than ever. Feelings of happiness flowed through her body, and she was so happy to have finally found the two. Cheyenne forgot the rain and the cold of night, and couldn't wait to embrace her beloved grandparents again. She would save them and everything would be fine again. The entrance gate of the enclosure was closed by a metal chain, and was now the only thing standing in the way of family reunification. Cheyenne shook it, but to no avail. Xaver drew his sword. "Go aside and let me do it." She did as he had told her. The boy lifted the scratched metal weapon and hit the blade with full force on the chain. It shattered with a metallic sound at the point of impact, and the lock fell to the ground. The door to the enclosure opened a crack before it was pushed completely open by Cheyenne. The loud noise had alerted the grandparents, and they spotted their granddaughter in disbelief. She ran towards them crying and fell into their arms. An incredibly strong feeling of happiness and joy flowed through the girl and warmed her from within, so that she no longer felt the cold rain. Xaver watched his friend and her grandparents and sighed with relief. It was nice that they were still alive. The two elderly people wore soaked rags and metal bracelets and collars, shivered from the cold, were pale in the faces and looked very sick. The faded brown hair stuck to their wrinkled faces, dripping with rain. Their condition did not make a good impression, and this worried the boy. Perhaps they had already been subjected to experiments that had a fatal consequence, but he remained silent and kept his guess to himself. Cheyenne's grandmother stroked her granddaughter's soaking wet hair and then lifted the girl's petite head up a bit with her hands so they could look at each other directly. The old lady also wept with joy, despair, and sorrow. She whispered a few words to Cheyenne in a shaky, rough voice. "Girl, what on earth made you come here? This is far too dangerous. Now, if something happened to you, your grandfather and I would have never forgiven ourselves. Oh my goodness, what happened to your neck? Dear, that must be very painful. What kind of things do you do?" The grandmother spoke softly and with concern for her beloved granddaughter. Cheyenne noticed how weak the old lady was. It took her 2 attempts to finally answer and find her voice again. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there this afternoon. I am so sorry I got you into this trouble. I am so sorry." The grandfather stroked his granddaughter's head reassuringly and made her understand that he did not blame her in the slightest for the whole misery. He just seemed happy that the girl was doing reasonably well. Cheyenne saw the old man shed tears for the first time in her life. Guys, I don't like to disturb this touching family reunion, but I think we should slowly get out of here, don't you think? After all, a researcher is supposed to show up here." Xaver spoke up worriedly. Everyone in the enclosure knew he was right. Just as Cheyenne turned to her friend, he was pushed to the side from behind and fell to the ground. Where the blond boy had previously stood, there was now a tall, menacing-looking knight. His armor suggested that he was quite muscular and strong, and was very different from the other knights who drew their swords behind him. It was golden and decorated with white plates connected by embellishments of the same color. A turquoise-green cloak was attached to the shoulder plates, which made this man look special, striking, and honorable. His hair had a strange cut, looked like 3 hung-up triangles, and could be seen on the sides and back of his head. His hair color was dark brown with highlights consisting of different shades of green. The tips were dyed white, with the exception of a hairpiece of the same color which covered half of his right eye. The knight's eyes were light brown, almost orange, and only the left pupil was in black. On the right side it was white. His gaze was empty, but at the same time wise and determining. The man's face was marked by scars and showed no sense of guilt for knocking the boy over. The knight stared directly into Cheyenne's eyes and pinched his to frighten in slits. He averted his gaze from the girl and looked at Xaver lying on the ground. Without saying a word, the fearsome man drew his mighty water-blue sword and pointed at the boy. He wrinkled his nose and touched Cheyenne's friend with the sharp blade on his neck. Xaver gritted his teeth and bravely, but at the same time frightened and disturbed, stood up to the knight's gaze. Cheyenne, like her grandparents, was horrified, unable to do anything, and she tried to gather her thoughts. With ease, the man in armor could now kill her childhood friend. She wanted to do something to help him, but didn't dare to make a move. She was sure that if she tried to help Xaver, the knight would not hesitate long and pierce the boy with his sword. She was powerless and had to wait and see what happened. Against all odds, however, the knight let go of the boy and gestured for him to get up with his blue blade, whose inner metal seemed to move like water, and go to Cheyenne. Xaver did what the powerful man had told him to do, jumped up and stumbled over to his friend. Protectively, he stood sideways in front of the girl as the knight in the golden armor walked a few steps towards her and ordered his troop, consisting of 6 other knights, to surround the 2 friends and the grandparents. Cheyenne's grandfather became angry. "What on earth is this supposed to be? Haven't you already made us suffer enough? Who are you anyway?" However, he received only mocking laughter from the ordinary knights instead of a response from the man in golden armor. None of this seemed to interest him in any way. The golden knight stood 2 meters in front of the friends and stared spellbound at the black crystal of the girl she wore around her neck. Cheyenne noticed this and covered the sparkling object with her hands, taking a step back, intimidated. The man closed his eyes briefly, then grinned and finally decided to say something. His voice was bossy, powerful, and decisive. "Stupid girl. Are you really carrying your crystal around with you all the time, huh? How careless. What if you lost it?" He paused for a moment and laughed a nasty, eerie laugh before grinning again and turning back to Cheyenne. He seemed to notice that the girl didn't understand why he was talking about the crystal. Either you're very difficult to understand or... They haven't told you yet. What a shame. Before the knight could continue speaking, the grandfather intervened again. "Just leave her alone." Again the man in golden armor laughed and raised his hand. 2 of the surrounding knights moved towards the old man and held him, roughly pulling him away from his wife, and he groaned with a pained face when one of the 2 men in metal stepped on his foot. Cheyenne's grandmother sobbed when she saw her beloved husband suffer. However, her granddaughter was rigid and did not know how to deal with the situation. It was all too much. The talk of the great knight, the sufferings of her grandparents, she was confused. Without paying attention to the old man, the knight continued to speak. "Well, at least you fell nicely into our trap. Your grandparents have also proven to be a wonderful bait. Your love for them is truly gorgeous. It was clear that you would try to save them, so we just had them brought here and waited for you to show up. Didn't you have any concerns that you could easily reach the research complex without being discovered? We have made sure that no one crosses your path. All the while we were able to make out your position from the control room. Didn't either of you notice the security cameras? Oh, that's right. In your slum you probably don't know anything like that." He paused for a moment to laugh. And didn't it seem strange to you that the researcher called out the exact data of your dear grandparents? I had more expectations of you, more than just a stupid, naive girl. Cheyenne looked down to the ground. Now it also seemed strange to her that they had no difficulty finding the old couple. Her grandfather was outraged and could no longer contain his anger. "What do you think, using us as bait for Cheyenne? You are a heartless scoundrel, a miserable bastard. He didn't get any further. The Golden Knight raised his hand again and moved his fingers, a fatal sign that triggered the cruel order. One of the two knights stood in front of the old man, drew his sword grinning, and rammed it with full force into the old man's chest. The blade pierced the entire upper body and reappeared dripping with blood on the back. The red juice of life stained the armor of both knights, and they laughingly enjoyed the agonizing moans and screams of their defenseless victim. The four remaining men in armor also began to laugh unrestrainedly, and the mighty man in gold could be heard whispering, his eyes closed, "I have no time for your thankless insults." Cheyenne's heart stopped for a moment. Her ears ached from the death cries of her dying grandfather. Then he fell silent forever and collapsed until he lay motionless on the red, cold ground. His blood, together with the relentless rain, now soaked the earth. The girl was unable to move. She was so shocked that she couldn't even cry. She breathed abruptly and stared at the dead body of her beloved grandfather, from which his murderer was drawing his sword and drilling it into the old man's flesh again. Cheyenne felt nothing but a tingling emotion. It was depressing and erased all her thoughts and other feelings. Then it was like ramming a knife into her chest, directly into her heart. She flinched in pain and moaned briefly and softly. She could no longer hear the laughter of the knights. Everything fell silent. With a blank stare, she watched as the knights kicked the old man one after another and robbed him of his last dignity for his insults. The rest of the environment was no longer noticed by the girls. Suddenly, her grandmother, who was holding on to Cheyenne, pulled her down and sank to the ground. Cheyenne realized that her grandmother was no longer aware of what the knights were doing to her former lover. Still shocked but worried about the only remaining family member, the girl knelt down next to the slumped grandmother. Her condition seemed to have deteriorated a lot, but it wasn't just because she had just seen her husband die. Cheyenne wanted to ask what was going on but couldn't find the words and couldn't bring herself to say anything at all. She saw blood dripping from her grandmother's mouth, and it was getting more and more. "Grandmother, what is going on?" But she didn't have to ask the question or hear an answer to know that these were the last breaths of her beloved grandmother. She too would have to go away forever and suffer before that. The old lady groaned and gurgled before she could quietly stutter a few words. "Are these the impacts of the liquid which they instilled in me? Cheyenne, you have to get to safety. I can't go on. I can't be with you and watch over you. You must live. You are the world's last hope, beloved child." The grandmother coughed and spat out a lot of blood. Then she stretched and couldn't breathe. She gurgled again, and then she did not move. Her eyes were open and empty. There was nothing left to see in it. Cheyenne sat emotionless and apathetic next to the dead body. She had stopped crying and felt nothing, absolutely nothing. Neither soul pain nor cold nor fear, simply nothing. The world seemed to have stopped. Everything was like in slow motion. Her blank gaze wandered around. Everything was as slow as if it would freeze at any moment. All she heard was screaming inside. Then her gaze remained fixed on the man in golden armor. She thought she saw a trace of sadness in his eyes and pity, but that was certainly just imagination. The knights were still busy laughing, and Xaver took the opportunity to pull Cheyenne to her feet. If there was a way to escape from this hopeless situation, it would be now, when all the knights were still distracted. But Cheyenne stumbled powerlessly over her feet and fell to the ground again. "Come on, Cheyenne, pull yourself together. We have to get out of here." The boy pulled her up again and held her, staring into her empty eyes. "You're not going anywhere." The Golden Knight clenched his hands into fists and then turned to his troops. "You useless worms have a more important task than killing yourselves with laughter. Bring me this damn girl or kill her and get me the crystal." He rebuked his men, and everyone approached the two friends. Xaver drew his sword. "That's it." But before the blades met, Arukas jumped over the metal grid into the enclosure and barked so loudly that a gigantic sound wave went into the direction of the knights and caused them to fall backwards. "Arukas!" Perfect timing. Xaver was relieved that the fairy wolf had appeared. The boy took Cheyenne, who had meanwhile found her balance but was still distraught, by the hand and hurried with her to the end of the enclosure. "Arukas, destroy this fence so we can get out." Xaver gave the order to the silver four-legged friend, and immediately afterwards he whistled through his fingers to call the horses. The fairy wolf meanwhile gathered his inner strength in front of his open mouth, and when it was strong enough he unleashed it in a magical turquoise glowing beam. In no time a huge hole had melted into the fence, and the three ran outside, where the horses had just arrived on a hill and danced nervously. As fast as he could, Xaver dragged Cheyenne up the hill, pushed her onto Falconheart, and gave the horse a slap that made it run. His friend was still apathetic and just had enough strength to stay in the saddle, even if she leaned more on the horse's neck than sitting. The boy also swung on Shiva and rode after the girl, followed by Arukas. The wind seemed to wake Cheyenne slowly, and she pulled herself up in the saddle. Apparently the friends had ridden into a forest. Noises came from behind. "Damn, they're chasing us!" Xaver rode next to Cheyenne and looked back. Then he seemed to think and finally have an idea. "Cheyenne, we're breaking up here. Give me your crystal." Puzzled, she looked at her chain pendant. "Why?" More than the breathing whisper she did not bring about. "We shake them off more easily when we split up. They only split up when you give me your crystal. They are not only after you, but also after your crystal, so give it to me." Xaver's voice trembled with excitement and concern. Cheyenne had never experienced him like she did at this point. The trees flew past them, but Cheyenne didn't like her friend's plan. "He's the only one I have left. I don't want him to go away too." Then Xaver rode closer to Cheyenne and tore the chain off her neck. The girl lost her balance and almost fell off her horse. "What are you doing?" But her friend did not answer, rode away from her, held up the crystal, and shouted loudly that he now had the object of desire. Although it was dark, the knight seemed to see something. But Cheyenne didn't care how they could see. She was just desperate. Xaver moved further and further away from her, but then he shouted something to her. "We'll meet in Saralay village in a few days. I'll be there waiting for you." Then he disappeared behind the trees. Cheyenne heard the knights behind her consult as planned, and then split up. 3 pursued Xaver, and the other 3 chased after her. Crying desperately, the girl rode through the nocturnal forest.